If you open the bonnet of a petrol car, you will find spark plugs sitting above every cylinder waiting to ignite the fuel. But open the bonnet of a diesel car and those spark plugs are nowhere to be found. So here's the question. Why does one engine need a spark while the other doesn't? Most people think the difference between petrol and diesel is simply fuel economy or the type of vehicle they power. But the real answer isn't found inside the engine. It begins inside the fuel itself. Imagine trying to light two different fuels. On one side is a dry pile of leaves. On the other is a thick log of wood. The leaves burst into flames with just a tiny spark. The log contains plenty of stored energy too, but a matchstick isn't enough. It needs a much hotter environment before it begins to burn. Petrol behaves like those dry leaves. Diesel behaves more like that thick log. That simple difference shapes the design of two completely different engines. Let's start with petrol. Petrol is made up of relatively small hydrocarbon molecules, typically containing around 5 to 12 carbon atoms, with octane often used as a representative molecule. Diesel, on the other hand, contains much larger hydrocarbon molecules, typically with 12 to 20 carbon atoms. As hydrocarbon chains become longer, something interesting happens. They become heavier, their boiling point increases, they evaporate more slowly, and they become much less volatile. In other words, larger molecules find it harder to escape into the air as a vapor. That's the key difference. Petrol evaporates readily and mixes uniformly with air, forming a combustible air-fuel mixture. Diesel prefers to remain a liquid, and from this single property, every major difference between petrol and diesel engines begins to emerge. Although both petrol and diesel engines use the same four-stroke cycle, intake, compression, power and exhaust, the way they ignite the fuel is completely different. In petrol engine, the air and fuel are mixed together before compression. The piston then compresses this mixture, but only to a certain limit. Why? Because every fuel has something called an auto-ignition temperature, the temperature at which it ignites on its own without any spark. If a petrol engine compresses the mixture too much, the temperature becomes high enough for the fuel to ignite before the spark plug fires. This uncontrolled combustion is called engine knocking, and severe knocking can seriously damage an engine. To avoid this, petrol engines use relatively lower compression ratios. A typical modern petrol engine compresses the mixture somewhere between 10 and 12:1. Imagine squeezing 10 to 12 liters of air-fuel mixture into just 1 liter of space. At exactly the right moment, the spark plug provides a tiny spark. That spark doesn't burn the entire mixture. It simply starts a chain reaction, releasing the chemical energy stored inside the fuel and driving the piston downward. Diesel engines take a completely different approach. Instead of compressing an air-fuel mixture, they compress only air, and they compress it much more aggressively. A typical diesel engine has a compression ratio of around 14 to 18:1. Imagine squeezing 14 to 18 liters of air into just 1 liter of space. As the air is compressed into such a small volume, its temperature rises dramatically, often above 500 degrees Celsius. The cylinder has effectively become a furnace. Only then does the injector spray a fine mist of diesel into this superheated air. The temperature is already above diesel's auto-ignition point, so the fuel ignites instantly, no spark plug required. This process is called compression ignition. Now notice what just happened. The chemistry of the fuel dictated how it had to be ignited, and the ignition method dictated how engineers designed the engine. Because diesel relies on compression ignition, engineers naturally build diesel engines with much higher compression ratios. Those high compression ratios, combined with diesel's combustion characteristics, make these engines exceptionally good at producing strong torque at low engine speeds. That's why diesel engines are ideal for trucks, buses, tractors, and heavy machinery. Petrol engines, meanwhile, are designed around spark ignition. They typically operate at much higher engine speeds, making them better suited for producing high peak power and quick acceleration. The different personalities of these engines aren't accidents. They are consequences of the chemistry of the fuel. So the next time someone tells you that petrol engines use spark plugs while diesel engines don't, you will know that the spark plug is only the final piece of the story. The real story began much earlier. The chemistry determined how the fuel behaves. That determined how it must be ignited. The ignition method determined the compression ratio. The compression ratio shaped the engine, and the engine ultimately shaped the character of the vehicle. Everything started with a hydrocarbon molecule. That's engineering from first principles. But this raises another fascinating question. If an engine already produces torque, why can't we connect it directly to the wheels? Why do we need a gearbox at all? We'll answer that from first principles in our future video. Cheers!